Now in this video, we're going to be taking a look at textures and lighting and such with 3D again, but it's a little bit different than we did with the macro effect, whereas we applied the texture and then we manipulated the angle and the camera and got a really interesting close-up macro effect. Here we're going after really dramatic lighting on texture and being able to use bump maps to create a more realistic, more tangible texture. So something you can actually feel like you can touch and feel the roughness of it. So here I have the wood texture that I used earlier on the blending elements with the water droplet effect. So we're just using the wood texture itself this time around. And what we're going to do is, again, like I said, we want to add some dramatic lighting to this scene. So let's go to the 3D menu. And we're immediately going to go ahead and just put this as a 3D postcard element there. So just go ahead and choose 3D postcard from the menu, or from new mesh from layer. And let's go ahead and open up our 3D and properties panels so we can edit all the lighting here. So if you remember from the macro video, I talked about the IBL, image-based light, that's on by default on these 3D postcards. Well, if I go ahead and uncheck that element, it's going to make the image go dark. And this is essentially making the lights, basically turning the lights off. So there's no other lights applied to this object. That was the only light on there. So by unchecking that, we've turned the lights on the room. Now we've got to introduce new light. So what we're going to do is in that environment property, or rather in the light section, I'm sorry, we're going to go in and add a new spotlight. Now you can see the spotlight shows up right away and it has that wireframe on it. And I'm actually going to drop the cone width here to about 75, and that's here in the properties panel with that spotlight selected. So now you just use the 3D tools. I'm actually going to use the slide tool to click and drag. So clicking and dragging down pulls the light away from the texture, essentially pulling it toward you, the viewer. And you can actually use the rotate tools to rotate the light around the object. So it's kind of like a flashlight effect in a dark room against the wall here. But we want to get it to where it's kind of shining a little bit right there, maybe increase the intensity, and we're getting this really dramatic light effect on the background. And that's just simply from that one spotlight there. So really kind of an interesting result if you want to get a really dramatic background with lighting and everything like that. Instead of doing gradients and such like that, do the 3D lights. You can absolutely control the lighting. Just like a photographer, you're essentially controlling the lighting while you're designing. What's better than that? So, like I said, I want the texture to react to this light too, very much the same way we did with the macro effect. But easier than that, we're going to be using the same texture to apply the bump map. So I'm going to select the background element here in the 3D panel, and then we'll just go down to the bump property. And when you click on the menu, you can choose to add a new texture or even load a texture, but you can also apply textures that have already been applied elsewhere on this 3D object, like for instance the background element here. So when I go ahead and select that, you'll see that the texture reacts. In fact, let me undo it. So because up close you can really see this. When I go into that bump property and choose the background, notice how it reacts to the light now, feeling like it's got a little bit more roughness to it. So you can actually touch it. And if I increase the bump amount, you'll see that texture get even more so. In fact, I'm going to bump it up to about 13 from the default there. So that's giving me a really interesting result with the bump map there. So I'm able to take a simple texture, put it in dramatic lighting, like it's actually lit in a room, and then apply the bump map to get the texturing on it. But now I want to add some text. So I'm going to go ahead and just set a text layer here, and we'll just go ahead and just type something simple like drama. Because we're going for dramatic light, let's go with a better font than that. I'll go ahead and use my go-to font for the moment. Let's go ahead and use Futura. Actually do Futura Medium. There we go. And let's go ahead and make it a little bit bigger and center the text inside the canvas there. And I'm going to go ahead and fill the text with white. So now what I want to do is make this text 3D, add it to the scene so it's reacting to the light as well and maybe casting a shadow on that wood texture and everything. So let's first go ahead and make the, go to 3D, go to new 3D extrusion from selected layer, there we go. And I do not need the ground plane shadow, so let's go ahead and bring that to 0 here in the properties panel and turn that off. And now I want to merge it with my texture below. Now, thing about merging 3D layers, when you have a layer selected on top and you merge it to a 3D layer below, it's going to assume the properties of whatever the lower 3D layer is. So all my lighting and dramatic lighting and everything I've got on this texture, I want to make sure that that's on the bottom before I merge these. If I had this texture above the text layer and merged it down to the 3D layer, to the 3D text layer, it would assume the lighting and all the properties of that layer. So again, make sure that the layer properties, or the 3D properties you want to maintain, keep it on the bottom. And I'm so simply press Command E and merge that down. Now Command E is the same command for merging two regular layers, but it also is the command for merging two 3D layers. Photoshop recognizes that they're two 3D layers and keep them as such. So now once it's merged and I move this to slightly, you can see that the shadow is now being generated by the lighting hitting, by the light hitting the text on this texture now. If I just move this around, you'll see that the text is kind of protruding out of that wood texture and it's picking up that lighting there. Now all I would need to do here now is go into that light section and that spotlight element. I'm going to go into the shadow properties here, and here you can see where it says softness. I'm going to increase that to about 25, and that's going to make my shadow here a little bit softer. So if I go and do a render here, I'm just going to hit my hotkey to do my render. And again, like I said, it's going to have a little bit of fuzziness to it. I've had people ask me this question. When I start rendering in 3D, it really looks really bad. Well, it's going to look grainy at first because if there's a lot of tonal ranges, shadows, and texture effects, something like that, it's going to start out grainy, and then each pass is going to make it a little bit more refined until it finishes the render and gives you a nice clean image in the end there. But now you can see by simply making the text 3D, merging it with the layer that already had my dramatic lighting and everything set, it already picked up that lighting effect and is already looking pretty good there. And in just a few, I'm going to go ahead and cancel the render just so you can see. But in just a few minutes, I've got a really dramatic scene with dramatic text, literally dramatic text, and the lighting. And of course, there's that bump map, using the bump information of the original texture to create a much more grittier texture on there. And it's simply using that lighting element in there, using those 3D effects in Photoshop. So another use of 3D lighting and texturing here in Photoshop CC.